Okay, so you can transfer your risk in two different ways. You can sue, because if somebody's negligent, which negligence is defined as the failure to act as a reasonable person, somebody's negligent, they cause your bodily injury or property damage, you have the right to sue them to recover for those losses, those damages. So you're transferring that risk to the negligent party by suing them. You can also buy insurance, and when you buy insurance, you're transferring your risk to who? The insurer, in return to the premium for the premium that you pay. So you're transferring your per risk to the insurance company. So let's take a look in the book. Second paragraph, retained when a person decides to assume financial responsibility for certain events. Deductible amount on auto insurance may be seen as a way the insured retains some portion of the risk. In addition, premium is reduced because of his assumption of the risk. To avoid a risk, a person might stay home rather than drive, or get one of those Razor scooters. They're lots of fun. Just make sure to wear a helmet. A risk is reduced when a person practices living a healthier lifestyle, thereby reducing the chance of major illness. 4, a risk may be transferred in 2 ways. So somebody's negligent, like I said, you can sue. Next paragraph, second method for transferring risk is accomplished through the use of insurance. Okay, one thing, so this is risk management. These are the 4 ways of how we can manage our risk. You'll notice there's no 5th one down here that says ascertain. Because here's an example of how they'll ask a question on the exam. So they're testing your knowledge. They're really testing their knowledge because they might ask a question like this. All of the following are ways a risk could be managed, except. So 3 of these, 1 through 4, will be listed. And then 1 that's not one of these 1 through 4 will be listed, such as ascertain the risk. And that's going to be your answer. So very tricky. You've got to know all 4, especially in that situation where they ask a question like that. You'd have to know ascertaining the risk is not a way to manage the risk. Law of large numbers. Moving on to our next heading here. Let's take a look up here on the board. And we'll just give an example here. Where we'll say, okay, law of large numbers. Essentially what this is it's a statistical phenomenon that occurs. The more people we have insured, so let's say we have 10 million people insured in this pool, and we have 100 people insured in this pool over here. So we'll say it's pool A and pool B. First question I have for you. Which one of these pools at the insurance company is going to have more claims during a given time period, say a 12-month period? Which one do you think, the pool with 10 million or the pool with 100? Well, the pool with 10 million is going to have more claims in a given time period. So first question. Second question. What is the purpose or what is that statistical phenomenon that occurs with the law of large numbers? Well, it states that the more similar risks we group together, the better the data becomes. So the easier it becomes for us to forecast future losses because we have more information to work with. So we could forecast much more easily with these 10 million individuals than 100. How many losses we're going to have in the next 12 months based on how many we had in the prior 12 months. So that's it. The law of large numbers states the more people you insure, the better your statistical data becomes. However, just because you're insuring far more doesn't mean you're going to have less claims than a much smaller group. And it also doesn't mean you can determine individually who's going to have a claim. So they couldn't pick me out and say, hey, Scott, you're going to get in a car accident on June 15th at 4:35 in the afternoon. Well, of course they can't. But they could say, out of these 10 million, we believe, 5,435 are going to be involved in auto accidents in the next 12-month period. So that, of course, helps them determine what they need to charge in rates to offset the claims that they're going to have to pay out. So, law of large numbers allows an insurance company to predict the expected losses of a group more accurately. Basic principle is the larger the number of separate risks of like nature combined, the more predictable the number of future losses. Essential this is underlined, then a large number of exposure units be combined. The next paragraph, if large enough numbers or exposure units are combined, the degree of error in predicting future losses decreases. Larger the group, the more closely the predicted experience will approach the actual loss. Then we go on to our next heading, insurable interest. Okay, so with the law of large numbers, maybe one question, if you have one at all. Same thing with insurable interest. Now we have two different product lines. Life insurance, P&C, or property insurance. Okay, insurable interest. In life insurance, you have to prove at time of application. And that's it. So when you're buying, this really only applies when you're buying life insurance on someone else's life. Because in order to prevent gambling, they state you have to benefit from the continued living of that individual in order for you to have insurable interest. And essentially, you have to be involved business-wise, so your business partners or immediate family. And you have to prove that you have that insurable interest for life insurance at time of application and never again. But since we're learning about property and casualty insurance, we need to know how that works there. We have to prove we have an insurable interest in the property 2 times. Time of app and time of loss. Now over here, remember, we only had to do it one time, time of application. So what's the difference between the two? In property insurance, we have to prove insurable interest at time of application and also at time of loss. Essentially meaning we have some type of financial interest in the property. So if I own a home and I buy a homeowner's insurance property policy on it, and I sell the home to somebody else, and I don't notify the insurance company and I continue to pay the premiums, and the house burns down 6 months after I sell it, can I recover on that loss? No. Why? Because I don't have insurable interest at the time of loss. So I have to have insurable interest when I buy the policy and at the time of loss in property and casualty insurance. Risk must involve the possibility of loss only, so it has to be a pure risk. On the next page, second paragraph, last sentence, for property and casualty insurance, insurable interest must exist at the time of app and at the time of loss. Then we get into a new heading, insurable risks. Now, and you're going to have 1 to 2 test questions on these next few things total that we're going to go over. In order for a risk to be insurable by the insurance company, there's a number of factors that must be present, and that's what we're going to be covering in these next few paragraphs. There must be a large number of homogeneous units, which means they must be similar risks. That's what the insurance company is determining in their underwriting. They're going to try and group together similar risks because they want to try and make a profit from selling the insurance. Next paragraph, loss must be calculable. In property and casualty insurance, they'll put an exact dollar value on it in the policy, and they'll say, your policy limit is $80,000 or $250,000. That's how they're saying it's calculable. They list it in the policy. Loss must be uncertain. Intentional acts are not going to be covered. So you set your own house on fire, that's great, but they're not going to pay a claim out on that, and you're probably going to go to jail. So the next one, economic hardship. The loss must create an economic hardship, so that goes back to insurable interest. I sold the house burns down, I don't care. I feel bad for the people I sold it to, but that's not going to financially impact me in any way. So there has to be an economic hardship that's caused. And last thing is exclusion of catastrophic perils. So we already talked about exclusions, remember, because we were talking about open peril or all risk policies. The way that you figure out what's covered is everything that's not excluded. So you look in the exclusions, if it's not excluded, it's covered. There are certain perils that are catastrophic that no insurance company wants to cover, and they're listed on the next page in the third sentence. Examples of excluded catastrophic perils are war, nuclear risk, and earthquakes. Next paragraph, adverse selection. Okay, so what's adverse selection? Adverse selection is when, essentially, from the insurance company standpoint or insurer, they're selling a policy that they know they're going to have a claim on. That's adverse selection. The insurance company does not want to do that because they go out of business if that was the case with every policy they sold. So, example of adverse selection, flood insurance. So, flood became excluded by most all private insurance companies. And in order to provide coverage for it, the government had to step in and create what's referred to as the National Flood Insurance Program that we'll learn more about in detail later. But that's a catastrophic peril and an example of a common exclusion in property insurance. So, there's a number of things involved like zoning where they can determine if you're in a flood zone or not. And if you are, and there's a huge storm, you're probably going to have a flood loss. So the insurance companies don't want to cover it. They'll exclude it, which means you have to go out and buy flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program. Principle of indemnity, this next heading. Okay, and this is something that when we're talking about property insurance policies, we are going to give an example here. And let's say that this circle on the left here represents us financially. So this is our financial structure here. Okay, we understand that if we were to be involved in a car accident and it's our fault, we're going to have some problems. We're going to have damage to our car. We're going to probably maybe have some medical expenses we have to pay. But then also, there's going to be maybe another car involved that we hit that we're going to have to be responsible for damages to. And also, there was occupants in that car, which we might be responsible for paying their medical expenses as well. So that is something that was uncertain, of course, that we don't expect. Now, if we buy property insurance for that, the property insurance follows this principle of indemnity. And it states, the reason that I have these circles, this represents the one on the left, represents me financially as a whole. If I was to be involved in an accident, I would have to pay for those expenses that I mentioned, and it would take a huge chunk out of my financial structure. Now, the purpose of the insurance and this principle of indemnity is to fill in this hole and make me whole again after a loss. Okay, so the purpose of my insurance is to make me whole again. Is insurance for profit? No. So the principle of indemnity states that my insurance will pay one thing. Well, one of two things. It will pay my loss or the policy limit, whichever of the two is less. Okay, so they will pay my loss or the policy limit, whichever of the two is less. So in other words, I cannot profit from my insurance. That's the principle of indemnity. So there's a lot of things we'll learn about that reinforce this principle of indemnity that are built into these contracts as we go throughout the course, because the insurance company does not want you to profit from this loss situation. And we'll see there will be certain situations where we might be capped out by our policy limit. And so that's where it's very important that you, as an insurance agent, are advising your client appropriately on the amount of coverage they need. Because if you have a high net worth individual and you're selling them minimum liability limits in their auto policy, you're possibly going to have an errors and omissions claim later on down the road. And we'll talk about that and see how that all ties in later, because the policy will pay the loss or the limit, whichever the two is less. And if that limit's not enough to cover the loss, guess who's going to be personally responsible? The insured. So they're going to get sued. And that means they're going to have to pay out of their personal assets over and above the insurance limits, which means you, as the agent, if you provided them inappropriate advice, you're probably going to get sued as well. So keep that in mind. We'll get back to that later. But back to the principle of indemnity, center of the page, restores the insured person in whole or in part to the condition he or she enjoyed prior to the loss. Restoration may take the form of payment, repair, or replacement. In life and health, principle of indemnity takes on a different meaning. Just talks about the earning power. We don't not concerned about that since we're not going to be selling life insurance with this license. So we go on to the next heading, which is types of insurers. Okay, so we had quite a few concepts that we went through there, and we're going into a new topic now. Insurers, which is who? Insurer is the insurance company or the person covered by the insurance? Is the insurance company. Now, insurance companies, they are legal entities, and they can be organized or structured in a number of different ways. And so that's what we're going to go over here. And you're going to have test questions on these. So we're going to start out with going over the differences between a stock insurer and a mutual insurer. Now, both of these are corporations, number one. Okay, so difference between the two. And these are the most two common types of organization of insurance companies, stock and mutual. So first thing we'll learn about, stock insurer is owned by stockholders. Stockholders, also known as shareholders. Okay, if the stock insurer pays a dividend, dividend is paid to the shareholder, which I'll abbreviate there. Dividends are taxable. And the last thing we'll cover here, they issue non-par policies. Okay, so stock is the first one that we talk about, but it's easy to remember as far as who owns the company because it says right in the name. The stockholders are the owners of the company. Synonym for stockholders, shareholders. Okay, so we've got that first part up there. Stockholders own the company. Second part, dividends are paid to shareholders. First thing, what is a dividend? A dividend is a sharing of company surplus. Who declares dividends? Board of directors, which I'll abbreviate here. The board of directors meet quarterly and they determine if there's a surplus if they want to pay a dividend. Can dividends be guaranteed? No. So just because a company is profitable does not guarantee that a dividend will be paid. If a dividend's paid, it gets paid to the shareholders, and the dividends from stock insurers are taxable as ordinary income. Last thing, the stock insurer issues non-participating policies. What that means is if I buy a policy from a stock insurer and they declare a dividend, it's not going to me. My policy is not participating in dividend distributions. Conversely, over here with the mutual insurer, owned by policyholders. So there are no stockholders in a mutual insurer. Second thing, dividends, if declared, are paid to the policyholders. Next thing, dividends, not taxable. Last thing, issue par policies. So let's look at the differences here. But first, let's talk about mutual to clarify further. If you buy, generally if it was organized as a mutual insurer, it was in the name. State Farm's a mutual company, but like Mutual of New York, the money group, Mutual of New York, Liberty Mutual, it was stated right in the name of the company if it was a mutual. And if it's a mutual, there's no stockholders. The ownership rests with the policyholders. So the same thing, the board of directors of the mutual declare a dividend. It can't be guaranteed. But if they do pay a dividend, it goes to the policyholders. And if the dividend is paid, it is not taxable. So down here, very important, not taxable. Now, another possible test question is why? The IRS classifies this dividend as a return of overpayment of premium, and we pay our premium with after-tax dollars. That's why it's not taxable. Last thing, issues par policies, because if you buy that policy and they declare a dividend, that policy allows you to participate in the dividends being distributed. So differences, the big differences here. Stockholders own the stock. Policyholders own the mutual. Dividends paid to the shareholders in a stock company. Dividends paid to the policyholders in a mutual. Dividends are taxable when paid to stockholders. Dividends are not taxable when paid to policyholders. Issue non-participating policy, stock insurer. Issue par policy with the mutual. So let's go ahead and look at the book. Under that heading, types of insurers, there's 3 different categories, you could say, of insurers. There's number one, private commercial insurers, which is what most people are familiar with. Then there's private non-commercial insurers, which are nonprofit organizations, like health maintenance organizations would fall into that category, traditional nonprofit ones. And the United States government, which provides, like I said, national flood insurance. They provide Medicare under Social Security. And then they go into the next paragraph, give some more explanation. Then we go into the different classifications. Number one, stock. Consists of stockholders who own shares in the company. Individual stockholders provide capital for the insurer. In return, they share in any profits and losses. Management control rests with the board of directors elected by the stockholders. Board of directors elects the officers who conduct the daily operations of the business. 2, mutual insurer. In a mutual company, there are no stockholders. Ownership rests with the policyholders. Vote for the board of directors, which in turn elects or appoints the officers to operate the company. Funds not paid out after paying claims, not used by paying for other costs, may be returned to the policyholder in the form of policy dividends. Dividends from mutual may never be guaranteed and are not taxable. So another thing you can't do, obviously, is say you're representing a stock insurer, you're trying to sell policies for a stock insurer. You can't tell a policyholder that buys a policy from a stock insurer that they're going to get a dividend. That would let me give you an example. That would be like telling me if I bought Windows, the new Windows operating system, that because I bought that, if Microsoft declared a dividend on their stock, that I would get that dividend. I'm not going to get the dividend. I own the software. Well, same thing over here. You own the policy that's issued by the stock. The owners of the company are the stockholders. They're going to get the dividend. 3, reciprocal insurers. Okay, so we leave stock and mutual and we go to reciprocal. And a few things here, maybe one test question on this. First thing, unincorporated. And I'm going to just use my expert illustration skills here to show you a dumbed down form of a reciprocal. Okay, all these boxes here, they're policies basically, but in a reciprocal, we call them indemnity agreements. So you see this term, indemnity agreement, in a question and they're asking about an insurer and they're asking you what type of insurer that is. Reciprocal. Also, I'm not an insured, I'm a subscriber. So I buy one of these indemnity agreements, they call me a subscriber. They call it a reciprocal because these indemnity agreements, we're agreeing, the subscribers, to insure each other in a circular or reciprocal fashion. Another thing that's specific to a reciprocal, not a CEO, they have what's referred to as an attorney in fact. So these are all things that are specific to a reciprocal. The biggest, most well-known is USAA, is a reciprocal insurer. They're very, very large, but they are, in fact, by definition, a reciprocal insurer. So we see in that paragraph, unincorporated group. Policies are called indemnity agreements. You buy a policy, you're called a subscriber. Managed by an attorney in fact. On to the next page. So we have our next category here, fraternal insurers. Now, fraternal insurers were created essentially as charitable organizations. And so you join this fraternal organization, and they have this insurance company categorized as a fraternal that would sell you life insurance. Now, one of the big differences here than any other type of insurer that we'll talk about is they issued what are referred to as assessable policies. That's in the last sentence there, it's underlined. Assess their policyholders. So most all policies, 99% of policies sold are non-assessable, which means, well, let's explain what assessable is. The fraternal gets into financial difficulties. They didn't charge enough. They've had way more claims than they thought they were going to, and they're running out of money. They have the right to assess every policyholder, send them a request for $200, $500, $1,000, so that they can collect that money and continue to operate. That's an assessable policy. You don't want an assessable policy. You want a non-assessable policy, and that's what 99% of policies sold today are, non-assessable. 5, reinsurance. Okay, well, we've been talking about, you buying insurance as an individual. But what if you operate an insurance company? Okay, so Here's the example I'm going to give. I've got an insurance company that I started, and it's called Shaky Quakes LLC. And what we do is we sell earthquake insurance. And specifically, we sell it in San Francisco. Now, I'm no dummy. I know everybody that lives in San Francisco needs earthquake insurance. So when I start this insurance company, I go out there and I start selling this policy. And in general, most insurance companies don't want to cover earthquake because it's a catastrophic risk. But, you know, it's been years since there's been a big one, and I've been rolling in the money. I mean, tons of premium. I'm rich. I live in San Francisco myself. Our corporate headquarters are downtown. And everything's going great until the big one hits. 10.0 on the Richter scale. And when that hits, I know I'm going bankrupt. Things have been good because we haven't had any claims. But when that 10.0 hits, every policy that I have out there is going to submit a claim, and it's going to ruin me. So when I have a risk like that as an insurance company, what am I going to do? I'm going to buy insurance from a reinsurance company. So right there, the first thing we learn, reinsurance companies do not sell insurance to the public. They sell to other insurance companies. Now, if I'm the insurance company buying the reinsurance, they refer to me as a ceding insurer. And there's a number of ways. So, you know, the reinsurance company issues a policy. There's a number of ways that the policy could be written, the contract. One of them is referred to as facultative. And here's what facultative reinsurance is. So let's say that each one of these little blue X's represents a property that I have written earthquake insurance on in San Francisco. And I buy a facultative reinsurance agreement from, well, that was a weird way to do it, but XYZ Reinsurance. And I determine that I want to reinsure these policies, these properties. Only the ones I circled, and I'm going to be responsible for the rest. That's facultative reinsurance. And there's other ways the policy could be written. But reinsurance really emerged as a way to provide protection for insurance companies that were writing high-risk insurance. So you see it utilized a lot in commercial risks, where you have buildings that may be valued at $1 billion or more, depending on the size of the building. No one insurance company can write that policy. So what they're going to do, if they do write it, they're going to reinsure it with another insurance company. Okay, so let's see what we have with reinsurance. Insurance between insurers. It occurs when an insurer, the reinsurer, agrees to accept all or a portion of the risk covered by another insurer. Companies often use reinsurance to reduce risk of catastrophic loss. Let's see what else. Insurance against loss by earthquakes and aviation incidents might not be available if a single carrier had to assume all of the risk. Because you have those 747s or 777s those things cost like over $300 million. I mean, you've got millions of them flying around in the air right now. So it's a huge risk, obviously. But reinsurers make it possible. They facilitate for a carrier to issue a policy and then share the risk with a larger insurer or group. Next paragraph, here's how the contract can be written. Reinsurance may be written on an excess of loss basis, which means the reinsurer will pay only a portion of the loss that exceeds the threshold. Quota share basis, which means that the insurer will share loss on a pro rata or fixed percentage basis, or is facultative, where the insurer elects to reinsure certain risks but not others. So as you see, the ceding insurer, why do they buy reinsurance? To limit their risk, just like the reason an individual would buy insurance.